everyone, welcome to the Hitchhiker's Way podcast. In today's episode, we have the co-founder of Incident, and he is Pete Hamilton, and his company streamlines and automates the entire incident management process. And Pete and his team has sold their products to some of the biggest companies like Netflix, Etsy, Loom, etc. And it's very great to have you, Pete. I think this is going to be an excited conversation.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. And I should get you to do all of my podcast intros. That was really kind. Thank you.
All right. So I just want to start everything with the origin story. So can you give a bit of a background to yourself, like from your childhood and your upbringing, and how did it actually affect your work ethic? And how did it shape your life?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a very broad and deep question, but it definitely did for sure. So I think, for me, I've always been interested in problems and, puzzles, and then computers became a very natural way to express a lot of that. And I followed a very, traditional computer science route. I went and did it at university. I loved it. And there was always something kind of a bit missing there. I was kind of doing projects at home and hacking stuff together. And then when I went into the computer science world, it was all a bit academic. And so I've always loved that practical side of things. And I guess sort of how that came into play in childhood and my very early years was kind of I'm not one of those people who's crowing about how they were coding when they were 6 years old. That definitely wasn't my vibe. But actually my dad quit his job when I was sort of in my early teens and sort of went out on his own and started his own business. So I kind of saw him doing that. It wasn't sort of the same as Instant. It was him and a couple of other people. But he had all these problems behind the scenes, right? Of spreadsheets that you were trying to solve some problems with, and workflows you're solving other problems with. And sort of as I started to learn more about how software engineering works, I was like, you could automate that, or if you just had a database, you could kind of automatically send those emails. And so just really piqued my curiosity. And so it was really cool. He was super supportive and really encouraged that. I think he could have easily said, no, go away, you're a child. But
when did you start coding in between? Like you were helping your father, right?
I think I probably started meaningfully trying to build apps, products, software about, I'd say 15, 16. And then by the time I was 18, I was trying to I was doing it a bit more for money and sort of, working for other people on the side outside of school as well. So yeah, it's really where I cut my teeth. And then I never really lost, I guess, that focus on building things for people. The academic sort of, building super, I guess, low level things just never really appealed. And I get my buzz and my hit from, solving problems and seeing people say, this is awesome, that's so cool, that solves my problem. And I think that's where it started, right? It's solving problems at home for his business. And I think, I was very lucky in addition, to your point on how did childhood shape your life. I think I was very supported, compared to a lot of people. I think had a very easy or strong start to life, and I really appreciate my parents for that. And I think my broader family, what's very interesting now I reflect on it, is a lot of them started their own businesses as well, and this isn't it was a sure thing. A lot of them took leaps. I think 3-4 of my aunts and uncles all at some point or other were starting businesses. And so I kind of always been surrounded by that mentality of you don't have to do the 9 to 5. So yeah, that just a couple of tidbits to your question, but hopefully interesting.
So, did you start working at Monzo, and how did it actually end up into Incident? Can you tell me the founding story of Incident?
Yeah, absolutely. So the founding story of Incident is a winding road, but actually interestingly started while I was at Toddler still. So I was involved in lots of incidents, big ones, small ones, several that will remain burned into my memory forever, I'm sure. And while I was there, I saw that someone at Monzo, Chris, now my co-founder, but at the time had never met Chris, had built an open source incident management bot, essentially. It was called Response. It's still out there. You can still use it. We actually come up against it in deals from time to time. And I thought this was really, really cool. And I was like, I think we could use this at GoCardless to, accelerate incident response. And I messaged Chris on Twitter, and we had a bit of back and forth. And then he ghosted me, and we never chatted again for 2 years. And then I joined Monzo, and I obviously, reconnected, and we were working on things together. And one of the places, so Chris was a director of platform, I was a senior staff engineer in operations, and often the place where we would end up sort of meeting was over a table when everything was on fire, or when we had a problem to solve, or a post-mortem to debrief on. And so that kind of kindled a bit of, okay, like this is fun, we've got a lot in common. And at that point I was then using the sort of MVP that Chris had built. And, that was very early on in Monzo, so this is about 2019. And then, a couple of years later, I'd say sort of, a year and a half, I was working really closely with Stephen, one of my other co-founders here. And we were sort of saying, look, we're both in relatively senior roles at the time, and we're spending a lot of time on, strategy, or spending a lot of time on sort of deep, thorny problems. It would be fun to do something small and throwaway, was how it started. And so outside of work, we started hacking on some things together. And one of the things we clocked was, this thing that Monzo's MVP'd feels like a really broad problem. Like, I had it, to my point, at Cardless. Stephen's seen the same thing before at Ravelin, the company he co-founded previously, and Chris has solved it again here. And when you see the same problem getting solved over and over, that's kind of, to me, a signal that there might be an interesting business there. And so, we started building this on the side. Chris got involved, and then we reached a point, I think we sort of launched it, for want of a better term, by sending one tweet each. And then it took off really, really quickly. And we were sort of like, oh no, we weren't quite prepared for this. We sort of, we've got day jobs. We can't almost have the size of customer who's trying to sign up. And so that presented a really interesting sort of pivotal point, right? Where we went, what do we want to do here? And I think at one point, early January, the year we left to start Instant.io, we had to have a very open conversation with the CTO of Monzo, Jonas, and my manager at the time, say, look, we're currently working, we're working sort of, 5, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. on Instant.io. We're working 9 till 5 at Monzo, and then we're working 5 till 10 at the end of the day on Instant.io. And, I want to do a good job for Monzo, but this thing is taking off, and yeah, we kind of need to make a decision. And obviously, given that we're chatting, the decision we made was, let's go for it. And I think, no regrets. We did it with Monzo's blessing. They were super supportive, and Tom and Jonas both invested in the company, and yeah, it's been an amazing ride. I think also, the kind of route into VC is an interesting one, and maybe we can talk about that later. But props to Carlos at Index, who's now one of our board members, who called me, I think, 15 minutes or less even after we sent those tweets to say, hey, we've built a thing, and does anyone want to try it? To sort of say, hey, what's the plan? This looks really cool. You guys should go for it. I think it took him a couple more months to convince us, but that was definitely an extra tailwind for us to kind of leave our full-time jobs and go for it.
So a lot of founders, especially when they're working at a company, like you were working at Monzo, and you were trying to build Incident at the site, and by God's grace, Monzo was super supportive to you, right? And that's how you left the company and you started on your own. But it would actually make a problem when the founder, especially in the early stage, when you're working at a startup and you are building another startup in the side, it would actually make a problem, right? With the founder with the founder questioning you as not being transparent about your work after. Yeah. How would you advise to deal with it? Like, what's your advice on that?
Yeah, great question. And it's actually something I've talked about with, 2 or 3 other now founders. They all took the leap. But yeah, it's something I've been asked a few times. And I think, my advice, and your mileage may vary on this advice because not every company is the same, right? If your company's super hostile, and some of them are, then this advice doesn't work. But I think if you feel like you have a company that really values an entrepreneurial mindset, has a really kind of, pragmatic and I guess supportive management team, like chances are that they expect this, right? You don't get to hire the really entrepreneurial, scrappy, hacky people and then be surprised when they decide that they're going to go like do something for themselves. I think that's the trade-off that you make. And I think Monzo made that trade-off really well. And lots of people stayed for a long time. Some people stayed for a short time. And sort of my advice in that scenario is you want to be as open and transparent as possible. And you just want to be very frank, right? The worst thing you can do is surprise out of nowhere your manager with a like, hey, I'm quitting. And also, by the way, I've been doing stuff on the side. And it just leaves a bad taste in everyone's mouth, I think. And also restricts your ability to actually grow your company, right? You can build in stealth mode, but number one piece of advice for startups is build something, MVP it, get it into the world, get the feedback. Like, how are you going to do that if you've got this looming, your manager would hate you, so you're not going to tell anyone behind you while you do it. So number one thing we did was we built a little bit on the side ourselves, and then we went and had a really open conversation and said, hey, we're really enjoying this. We're going to work on it outside of work. I promise it's not going to affect my work day. I had two laptops, like my home one and my Monzo one, and I would work on my home one in the morning, and then I'd slide it to the left at my desk. This was during COVID, and slide the Monzo one over at 9 o'clock. And then at the end of the day, I'd slide the Monzo one back over to the right and my personal one back over to where I was working. And, I think just being really open in that way really helps set you up. And it meant that when we had the conversation where we said, look, this is going really well, and I don't think I can continue doing this early mornings and late nights, it's going to start impacting on my job. I'd rather talk about that with you early versus when it becomes untenable. They were very supportive and understanding of that because they could see it coming, right? And, at the point where someone on my team told me they're going to do something on the side and then I can see it gaining traction, I really appreciate that because it gives me a chance to plan ahead. And I go, look, I want you to be successful. I want you to go and, kind of carve your own butt. As a leader in the business, I need to understand, I need to plan ahead and know that I'm going to need to hire a replacement. And, if we all just have our cards more open, that makes that a kind of, bi-directionally much more, productive conversation. And I've always done that. My manager at Go Cardless, very much the same, Neil, the CTO. When I was thinking about leaving for Monzo, I started that conversation very early as well. And, he was amazingly supportive, and I still appreciate that and sort of talk about it and remember it. And I think that's how do you want to leave, but there's also, as a manager, you care about how do you want to be left. So that's my sort of reflections and advice on both sides is be very open, be very transparent, and it'll accelerate you and also make leaving a little bit smoother as well.
So you left your job at Monzo, and what convinced you to leave your job at Monzo? I think you were at an important phase in your life at that point.
So yeah, I guess sort of, lots of other people trodden this path before me, many much harder decisions. So mine was relatively easy, but I think, the number one thing that convinced us to leave and do this full time was, twofold. One, we were having a ton of fun. We were also really enjoying Monzo, to be clear, but this was trajectory-wise really exciting. And we had customers and traction, right? It's there's nothing more exciting than having people say they desperately want to use your product and people sort of banging the door down. When we expected to get a few people say they might be interested when we sort of released it to the world, and we got 200 companies on the first 24 hours saying I would be interested
Amazing.
To trial this, right? And at that point you're kind of okay, to meaningfully go after this, we kind of have to give it more time. And it's like a small fire, right? You want to fan the flames, and you just can't do that in the around the edges very effectively, I don't think. Maybe if it's a bootstrapped side project, there's plenty of people that do an amazing job of that. I think for us it became very clear very quickly with the size of customers that we were talking to, having those early conversations with the Etsy's or the Airbnb's or whatever. I think as soon as you're having those chats, you're I'm not sure I can build a product that is good enough for these guys. And what if it goes wrong in the middle of the day? You're going to have to choose between your day job and your side projects, and it's not a set it and forget it thing. And so to us, that really was the signal that this had to be a full-time commitment or nothing. That was the trigger point for us. Was lots of inbound, lots of potential, but it needed 24/7 love and attention to grow.
Interesting. So you told that you the first set of companies 200 SMBs at the first launch. Did you find a way to close these customers repeatedly, maintain retention? How did you get your first set of customers?
Appears, from my perspective, to be a never-ending challenge. So I'd love to say we've nailed it. I think that would be poor form on a podcast where I think candour's needed. I think, if I look back to our first few customers, honestly, when you're building a sort of DevTools product or DevTools adjacent product, your network is the first place you start. And if I look back, I could probably go find, some of those early WhatsApps where you're pinging someone who joined some company and going, hey, I'm building this thing. Do you want to beta test it? Do you want to try it? Lawrence, is literally the first person we hired, was at Go Cardless, where we'd worked together, and he was one of the first people I hit up for some feedback, and he kind of kicked the tires. I don't think he was very impressed. It didn't work on the demo, but he was I think this is promising, and I think here's all the things that I would do. And then a couple of months later, the conversation turned into, okay, maybe I could come help you do it. And so even there, where didn't end up selling to Go Cardless for quite a while, there was an upside to those early conversations. But just just being open with your network and sort of having those direct chats. There was no big fanfare, there was no big marketing, there was no ad campaigns. It was literally just word of mouth. And the downside of that is the reach is very low in relative terms, but the upside is the signal's very high. And so if you can convince, firstly your friends, that's great, but they're your friends, they might use it anyway. Like if you can convince the second order network to start using you, that's where you've really got some traction. And I think the way we tried to keep ourselves honest on that front was we charged from day one. And so we didn't want the sort of, the pity users who are like, yeah, I'll use your product and then don't get any value. So we were really militant on saying like, no, you pay. And what that meant was when people were like, I love it, it's great. We're like, great, it's £1,000 a year. Like, oh, it's not £1,000 a year, great.
I get it. Then
you have the good conversation, which is, okay, well, what would make it £1,000 a year, great? And now we're, having the same conversation, but it's $500,000 or whatever. So that kind of stays, that mentality forever. It's like, it has to be, a conversation about value versus, doing me a favor.
During the conversation between your network about the product, what did you actually get right? And what actually started adding up more and more to the growth?
Yeah, so I think in the early days, one of the things we got right was we took a mindset very early on. We took a few mindsets that I think have really stood us in good stead. I think the first was that we had this concept of like meeting customers where they are. And I think if you look at Incident.io, it's an incident management product and there's a lot of value we add there. But I think if fundamentally you look at the mechanics, it's more of a social product, right? Incidents are fundamentally about coordination, communication, like signal to noise ratios. And those are a lot of the same problems that you solve in your communication tools. And I think one thing we did that was quite different to a lot of the competition at the time, which we didn't know about until slightly later on, but reflecting on it, one of the things that a lot of the competition, several of whom are no longer in business, did was they built like web app first, right? They're like, we're going to be the hub. And I think we took a very different approach, was we're not going to be the hub, we're going to be the glue. And what we're going to do is we're going to find an existing hub, in our case, Slack. And that's already where you work. Slack has spent huge amounts of money teaching you all the primitives, how to operate on this platform. If we can hook into that and be where you're already working, and we can bring some of your other tools to you, we don't have to fight the hurdle of like, oh, we need you to work in our product. We just need you to work with our product. And so that was like one of the things that very early on, we just got to ride this wave of, is essentially, do you use Slack, and does your software fuck up from time to time? And if the answer to those two things is yes, like you should probably buy it. And we got a lot of very good, very early traction. Obviously over time, that narrative has to change slightly, and it's, you hoover up all the easy deals first, but a lot of our very early growth was based on that. And then word of mouth and spreading.
That is interesting. Like a lot of companies use Slack, and it could be really easy to use your product at the same time while using Slack. So it would be better for them to buy your product, right? In that sense.
Exactly. A lot of what we were finding that people were doing was, Slack's this incredible, powerful platform, and what they were doing was kind of papering over janky incident response processes with documents and flowcharts, and maybe their Slack channels had lots of signal or lots of noise and lots of information, but the problem was all about the coordination and the signal to noise ratio, and making sure that after an incident's over, you pull that value back out so that you can look at your incidents over time and run them all the same way. And so we were able to add a sort of structural layer on top of Slack where we could connect more effectively with other tools, and we could make sure every incident follows a very similar process. That was kind of where we started, was kind of bringing some calm to the chaos of an incident. And then since then, we've been able to sort of build much more on top of that and build lots of value outside of Slack, like postmortems and, exporting issues to Jira or Linear and things like that, which are not, you don't really do that from within Slack, but after an incident's over, we've given you somewhere to go to do that separate to Slack.
Awesome. So I want to just divert the conversation. During this whole growth phase, you were also going through an important phase in your life. Like, I think you were married to your wife at that point, and you had a toddler, and you had to... How did you maintain your mental sanity during the whole process?
I'm not entirely sure that I did, if I'm honest. Yeah, so it's about a year into the, we knew that we wanted, I got married just before Monzo, so we were a couple of years into being married by the time I started the company. And one of the conversations we had, because it's always, it's a partnership going into this, right? It's like, before I go into this crazy journey of starting a business, we know that we want to start a family, and that these two things are going to collide. And we knew that going into Instant IO, and I talked to Stephen and Chris about that going into Instant IO. And I think, in reality, sort of, didn't quite know what to expect. I think lots of people do it, like starting a family, like mums and dads, while they're starting their businesses. And one of the first things I did, which is interesting, is I went and I just like desperately tried to find out, like, how on earth do you juggle these two things? Because they're both all consuming, and you want to give as much of yourself to both as possible. And I was like, I'm used to being able to work until 1 a.m. and not having, other than obviously spending, meaningful time with my wife, like, I don't have huge numbers of commitments outside of work, and that didn't really bother me. But as soon as you have a kid, that's all going to change. And so the first thing I did was look for, what have people written about this? What advice do people have? And honestly, there's not that much, advice for dads or mums who are trying to, start a company. It's not even like a late stage company, right? It's like, there's 12 people and it's potentially dead in a year. Like, it's that level. How can I take, a month, 2 months, 3 months off to look after a newborn
baby? And your wife also was running a business
Yeah.
at that point, right?
Yeah, so she runs her own business as well. And so we were like, do we both step away from our fledgling startups? And like, do I step away and she sort of stays in hers? Do we juggle it? And man, it was super hard. I think I got some really good advice. I went and chatted to lots of other founders, and that's where Founder Network was just so helpful. And it was like, people would give advice on how they'd navigated, should I get a nanny? Or like, how do you debate the kind of, cost benefit of that? Like, people had advice on managing work-life balance. And I think what was interesting was the number one piece of advice that I had, or the number one piece of reassurance, I guess, was like, when you have a kid, your life will become work and like the kid. That's just what's going to happen. And they were right about that, I think. You kind of sacrifice a bit of, me time, and that's fine. And then the other thing that I found really interesting was a lot of the advice was like, far from you will feel tired and you will feel like exhausted, but your motivation will like double overnight. And I kind of went like, yeah, I kind of maybe like, it sounds exhausting. I think I'm just going to like, I'm just going to get through it. And then had my son, and yeah, like it really does work like that. I think suddenly a couple of things become very clear. One is that, while you thought every hour in the day was precious before as a founder, when you have a child at home that you are not with because you are at work, those hours become twice as precious, right? It's not just it has to work. It's like it has to be worth it. I think that was the first thing. And then the second is like, I'm no longer just doing this for me, or like, it'd be nice to have some good, story to tell in 10 years time and maybe some like financial freedom. Suddenly you're doing this for this like tiny person. And I think both of those things combined, like the relentless focus on time management, and then the kind of motivation to kind of, I guess, like provide sounds a bit archaic, but just like, I want to win for me, but I want to win for like him now and for my family. And I think those were two very, very powerful emotions coming back to work, where I kind of came back, physically exhausted, but very, very bullish on like, we can do this, and like we're gonna smash it. And I'm about to go and in a couple of weeks my second child's born, little baby girl, and I'm not sure you get the multiplicative effect a second time, but yeah, definitely thinking about that more and more as sort of family expands. And yeah, really, really excited, really looking forward to it. And this time going away with managers and some structure in place versus, I was comparing my first paternity document with my second, and the first one is full of things like, don't forget to pay people, and this one's a little bit more strategic. So it's nicer journey the second time around.
I think you should write a blog after this. Like, how did you manage everything? You should put it up in a blog.
Absolutely. I've spoken to a few people about it, and yeah, had that suggestion a few times. I just need to get my act together. For what it's worth, there's a really good one. My friend Ravin, who's the CEO over at Creedle AI, just had his baby, and he's written a really nice post on LinkedIn about some of the challenges and highlights and lowlights, and we were WhatsApping about it the other night. And yeah, it's definitely doable. I think like one amusing piece of gossip from when we were starting the company and speaking to investors and things, and I knew at this point, however many months in, 6 months in, so I knew that Agnes was pregnant. And we spoke to one investor I can't remember how we got onto the topic, but they didn't know that we were expecting. And Stephen and Chris did, and they were there at the table. And the investors somehow got onto the topic of starting a family and starting a company. I think they'd recently had a child themselves. And we're talking about how, they would absolutely never do it, and it would be like near impossible, and would inevitably just blow up in your face. And I was sat there just sort of nodding along going, interesting, good, okay, cool, I'm feeling super confident now. So yeah, they ended up not investing in the company, and Carlos was super bullish, so thank you for the support there, mate.
I think it's a good thing actually, because his interest did not align with yours, right?
Yeah, I think it depends how you look at it, right? And let's be real, starting a family and a business, it forces you to make trade-offs that are hard. It's like, I can't work for 2 weeks away from home. I've got a tiny toddler. I don't want to do that, right? It's an active choice that I'm making. And in a world where I didn't have that, maybe I would have given the company more of my time or made some more useful and high leverage decisions. So it's kind of, let's not pretend that it doesn't change anything. But I think to say or take the view that it's so detrimental to your ability to have impact in your business that you're not as investable, or you prefer not investing in founders that have families or something like that. No one said that to me, but I think if you took that view, then yeah, it'd be super misaligned. And I disagree in the same way that it's people have kids all the time, just doesn't mean that they're worse at their job when they get back or anything like that. So I think it's we live in 2024, and I think plenty of people have families and are crushing it. And I think it's more important to find and highlight those role models than it is to sort of debate whether or not it has an impact. It does have an impact, but there's enough people out there proving you can do it that I think people shouldn't feel dissuaded. That would be the message that I'd take away. I just have 2 awesome things to spend my time on now versus 1. So
exactly, there are tons of ways to build a company, and
exactly.
Also, one of the interesting stories that I read about your company was how you closed Etsy in the early days. Can you walk me through the experience of closing the customer? How did you do it, and what was the insight that you learned from it?
Yeah, I think so. Etsy was a real roller coaster, and massive props and thanks to the team over there. They've been amazing and super supportive. I think sort of a huge amount of the products have been shaped by them, so very grateful for that. I think the first thing is we didn't close Etsy the first time around. So I think we had a conversation. I think it was with Jeremy over there, and it was very early on, and we sort of showed them the product, and the feedback was, no thanks. It's not ready. It's not what we need. And then we didn't talk to them for a year, and we were super bruised. We were like, oh no, maybe this is rubbish. Etsy is so well respected in the space. Maybe what we're doing is not that useful. And we got our heads down and we just built for I think it was about a year. And then out of nowhere, we kind of ended up having another conversation, and turns out you can get a lot of stuff done in a year. Who knew? And so when we showed them the second time around, they were like, you know what, this is actually pretty good and really interesting. And so we sensed the opportunity there, and we kind of had some really, really great conversations with them. And then it got to the point where, they gave us, what we would internally refer to as the list. And this was, they went through everything that they cared about. And they gave us a list of, let's say 30 things that ranging from critical must-haves to nice-to-haves. And we were in full-on deal closing mode. And we had a small team at this point, 6 engineers or something like that, 5 engineers. And they sent us this list, and we knew they were talking to other vendors, and we knew that the product wasn't quite where it needed to be. And one of our major competitive advantages at this point is speed, right? And so we literally said internally, this is now the only thing we care about for the near future. And everyone tools down this list of things that Etsy care about. We're going to get it done ASAP. And I think it was a few days later or a week later, we went back to them and said, okay, done. What else have you got? And Etsy's response was kind of they were pretty surprised, I think, by that. And I think the response we got was something along the lines of, we've not only sort of read through their list, but we've built all the things that were missing. And we'd done that before any of the other vendors had even replied to the email where they shared the lists, right? And so I think that was something that for us really cemented a bit of company culture of like moving fast and just really delighting customers through the speed at which you can deliver on some of their asks. Because some of those things are huge and they're strategic and they take a long time. Some of them are really small and they're not the same and you shouldn't treat them the same. And I think that deal at that point was just like it wasn't like a turning point in company culture, but it was a real milestone moment of like, we can do this. And then Etsy saying yes. I just remember closing that deal. That was the biggest deal we'd ever closed in company history. And it was such a team effort. And yeah, I mean, you get your first taste of that and you're, immediately everyone's like, let's do it again. And then later down the line, like, similar story with Netflix. And I think, those deals where you lose them, I think it was very similar, but it's like you kind of lost them, you're not ready. And then they come back a year later and everyone just really, really helps drive it across the line. Those are some of the sweetest ones. I love an easy deal, don't get me wrong. I'd never turn down easy revenue. But I think some of the ones where, as a company, you really had to, fight tooth and nail to, give the customer the things that they really, really valued, and then you win that business. Like, it feels so earned. And I think, it's an amazing experience for the team. And yeah, I think the people that were there, never forgot that, and never should they. Hopefully we can do it lots more.
We've actually earned everything. And,
and then the partnership grows, right? So it's, we do that for them once, and then, a year later, they've helped us improve the product loads more. We set the tone, and then, we'd love some testimonials. Like, they're the first ones on deck to do that for us. Or we want to try and do a case study, and they're like, hell yeah. Like, we spent 2 years building this thing alongside you. And it's just one of those, relationship building compound things that grows. It's like the way you start ends up being the way that you go on. And I think some of our most sort of, meaningful partnerships with customers have come from those crazy origin stories. We've also done it, honestly, for customers where we've lost the deal. And I don't regret that either. Like, it's for the team an amazing experience regardless. And it's that kind of every inch matters mentality.
Actually, I think I'm seeing the fast-moving culture in Incident. And I saw one tweet of yours which explained how you came up with a feature within 29 minutes. Man, that's fast. Like, I think it was pretty recent, and right now the company would have grown and would have had more employees. Like, how do you still maintain that kind of velocity within the company even when it's growing?
Yeah, great question. I think the first thing is that we don't ship everything in 30 minutes, to be clear. It's like there's a lot of things that we spend a lot of time on, and I don't want to sort of pretend like we're this absolutely wild, everything gets shipped in under an hour machine. But we do ship a lot of things really quickly. And I think, when you look at like how have we managed to do that, a lot of it comes down to culture. It's like, what's the mindset that people take, and what's the level of autonomy and ownership that they're given to go, hey, I think I could do that in 30 minutes. Like, how many hurdles stand between them coming to that realization and it going into production? So I think that's the first thing, is we worked really hard to kind of keep that culture where the number of hurdles you had to cross was very small. Like, the reason we have, our roles are called product engineers. They're not software engineers. They're not architects or anything like that. It's product engineers. And it's because, we expect them to have that intuition of like, this is not only something the customer wants, but it's something that resonates with the direction we're going. Let's just do it. Like, it's and there's a curve there as well, where culturally you want people to understand that, there's a halo, there's a window of opportunity where, if you say to me, Pete, it would be like, it's a pipe dream, but it would be so cool if you could, and then, insert idea here. Like, there's a window now of about, let's call it, like, for some companies, like 24 hours. For some companies it's longer. It's like you could deliver it in a month and they'd still be super surprised. But there's a window where, like, if you can deliver that, like, the surprise and the delight that you get from that will be huge. Past that point, there's a real decay curve. It's like, if I deliver that for you in 7 days versus 14 versus 30, it just doesn't land the same way. And so you really want to optimize for that culturally. And then the other part is tooling and process internally. So, how quickly, from the point at which my code is ready and tested well locally, can I get it, how quickly can I get that into production and in a safe way, right? You don't want to rush those things. Like, we don't shortcut for those kind of ships. So, we need to make sure that if we want to be able to ship really quickly, the time between local and prod should be as short as possible without skipping any steps. So, we get through all of our batteries of tests, integration tests, go through a pre-production environment, go into production. Like, all of that's as automated as possible, so that all the engineers have to think about is solve the problem, like implement and then ship, and then the main thing is then telling the customer. And we have this nice little mantra we use internally when we do that, where we have a kind of, usually there's a little thread and you get some delight from the customer, and we make sure that goes publicly inside the company. And then, the way we refer to it is like, this is how we win, right? It's like, this is the thing. This is what it's all about. It's like shipping value for customers as fast as we possibly can. And not everything can be shipped in 30 minutes, but that's the mentality that I think we need to aspire to, because you're a startup. Speed is one of your primary advantages over any incumbents or larger companies, and you gotta use it.
And that's amazing. Actually, building products. During the early days, you were speaking to all of these customers, and you were getting a lot of feedback, right? So there's this thing from Henry Ford that if he had asked people what they wanted, they would have told faster horse, meaning the customers wouldn't know what the solution is correctly, but they know the end point of the solution, the outcome of the solution, right? But Ford figured out that it was the car, not the faster horse, meaning the solution was figured out by the founder. But there's also a fine line between staying ahead of your customers and losing them, right? You don't need to stay too ahead, so the market is too early and they cannot find a real use case for it. How do you kind of identify that, and how do you keep innovating things in the company?
Yeah, I think it's a great, very topical question for us at the moment, because I think we had a lot of very strong early pull from customers that was like hyper aligned with where we thought we should take the product. And so, it's almost like we're all pulling in the same direction, whether it's faster horses or cars, we're going for the same thing. And we didn't do a lot in the very early days that felt like we had to kind of convince customers or like dig really hard to find the root problem, because what they were presenting with was actually the superficial one. So very, very early on, you're like hyper aligned with your customers. You're filling in all the blanks, basically. It's all the obvious stuff. What's interesting is, like, a couple of years into the company, you start to, you're like, oh, we've kind of built all the really obvious stuff. And so then if you start asking customers what they want, they'll start tacking things on to the product, and it becomes quite kind of incremental. And you have to work a lot harder to go, okay, well, like, we solved most of the problems, but 80% of your problems now, quote unquote solved. Like, talk to me about the other 20%. Like, what, and don't tell me necessarily even what you want. Kind of, let's dig deeper into kind of why do you want it. And all of that sounds a bit like product-y, hand-wavy, but this is where I think, product management is such a key discipline here, which is like, you need to talk to customers and not just ask them what they want you to build, but like, what problems are you trying to solve? What are the things that your organization are finding the hardest at the moment? And what we generally find, and it's kind of interesting, is for a product like ours, the needs are very varied. Every big company has done their own version of our solution in like a ton of different ways. And so you can't sort of average out. Otherwise, you end up with a product that's like the color equivalent of beige. It's like everything just comes together, and you end up going like, no one's excited by this anymore, because it's averaged out. And so what we found instead was, what worked well was synthesizing all of that customer feedback, but then applying a heavy dose of our own intuition, and whatever we felt made most sense just intuitively, that becomes the default. So that's what, by default, we say, look, this is how you should do it. And then kind of we give people these, configuration options or customization or flexibility and off ramps to kind of tweak it to their own needs. So sort of, we're going to pitch you the car, but if you want to kind of like pare it back a bit and turn some stuff off, and you're not quite ready, like, you can implement faster horses on our platform. That's fine. But like, where we're going for cars. And so, examples there are, we've pushed on a number of things that where we leverage AI in instance, right? And that is, in my mind, absolutely the North Star. That's where we need to go. It's like proactive value, whether it's for leadership, whether it's for ICs, that's where we're going, right? A lot of organizations are very uncomfortable with that, right? They're like, no, AI will never replace this stuff. I don't want it anywhere near my instant management processes. And it's like, that's fine. That's, we'll give you some defaults. You can change them. You can turn this stuff off. But you're going to want it. And I think you have to have that intuition combined with conviction to say, they want cars. And the interesting question there is like, are you right? And I think that's then the job of, founders and leadership team or whoever to kind of, make those bets, right? On behalf of 80 people who, follow you and sort of buy in and help you build the thing. And ultimately, the job is to be right more often than not on the things that matter. And you've got to take a leap. If it was obvious, everyone would do it, and you wouldn't have the analogy that you shared, right? It's like if everyone could clearly see it,
Yeah.
you wouldn't have that situation. So you've got to do some stuff where maybe customers slightly disagree, and you've got to plant your feet on your defaults. And it's fine to flex around that, but you have to sort of stay the course on the stuff you believe to be the future of the product.
So right now, is it? I think it's easy for you to close customers with AI integration, and it was tough before, right?
Yeah, I think AI. It wouldn't be a podcast episode if we didn't talk about AI at some point. But yeah, I think very early on, when I think it was shortly after like ChatGPT started to come out and get talked about more, and got talked about a lot at the time. We saw that, and we could immediately see, we were like, okay, we're in the business of turning unstructured data into structured data, leveraging that for better instant response. This just feels like this is where it's going. And we spoke to loads of customers, and the pool was really weak. People were like, nah, I don't really see it. I don't really understand it. And also then you're dealing with legal teams that don't understand it, and they're freaking out. And you're like, okay, like even if we built an amazing thing here, I think we've got a bit of a headwind. Then about 6 months later, we came back. We did some spiking internally for ourselves. We were really, really excited by it. Went back to market, and the game was totally different. And you've got huge players like Intercom, who are now a customer, which is really cool. But they led the way with like Fin, their kind of AI co-pilot for CS teams. You've got like other companies, the Anthropics of the world. So you've got all these companies that are selling to very large enterprises, and now everyone's a bit more educated. Everyone understands. Everyone's seen the potential. It's hit the mainstream news. Then it was totally the opposite. Like then you get loads of pool. People are not super stressed about it. They've kind of got their heads around some of the security ramifications. So yeah, we were like maybe a little bit early on the AI stuff the first time round, and then sort of went again for another round 6 months later, and yeah, never looked back. Now we have loads of really awesome AI features in the product, and all the way from things you'd expect like summarization of incidents. It's like, yeah, it's a no-brainer. Everyone's going to do that. Through to we've actually found like a lot of value in sort of efficiently configuring the product, so we can intelligently go like, oh yeah, plug in all of your service catalog and all of your different systems, and we can kind of suggest how you might want to configure Incident IO to intelligently route your alerts to the right people, or that's the kind of stuff where actually I think it's like, where is someone going to have to click a lot of buttons in a very boring way? That tends to be, in my experience, where AI actually gets the most love. It's not the shiny magic demo stuff, it's the make my real job that I have to do for 8 hours a day a little bit easier stuff that really gets the love.
Amazing. So I want to go back to the fundraising story of Incident. Like, how did you get your first seed check? Was there an interesting story there, and did you learn some kind of insight from it?
Yeah, our first seed check. So, I mentioned earlier, but so Carlos at Index, one of our board members, I worked for him at Go Cardless, and sort of then he'd moved on to Index, and we'd sort of not worked together for many years. So he called me super quickly, and not with a check, to be clear, but with a bit of like, and I said to him at the time, I was like, we're not raising money, we're not going to go the VC route. I just bought a battered old van, and I was like, I'm going to renovate the van, and we're going to build Instant IO while I travel around Europe. And anyway, the sort of the early dreams of being an indie hacker on the road, that was kind of where my head was at. And as always, gave me a lot of very interesting framing of like, look, this is how big it could be. And I kind of went, yeah, maybe. And then, to my point earlier, ended up with lots of big customers saying, I really want it, and went, oh, maybe Carlos is right. And so went back and talked to him. We shaped up, what we were planning a little bit. And the thing that I think, other than, hopefully I like to think the founding team, I think at seed stage, they're often investing in you as much as they are in the idea, honestly. I think the thing that got us that early check, and a lot of our angels who are super awesome, was, aside from a bit of track record ourselves, was the fact that we had customers. And the number one piece of advice that I give to folks that are looking to, sign a seed check or, a pre-seed or whatever, is like, you kind of, you don't need a deck. If you can just say that you have customers, say that you have some traction, that's worth way more than any deck would be. And so, yeah, we never made a deck. We never got around to it. We basically just said, look, we're busy, we're making money, we're signing up customers, would be delighted to accelerate it, but we're not looking. And I think, wasn't very experienced with fundraising at the time, but in hindsight, I can say that the number one kryptonite for VCs is, don't worry, we're making revenue, we have customers, and we're not looking to raise any money. And that tends to be the point at which they start, hammering down your email inbox. And then went very similarly to the Series A, honestly. We didn't have a deck. I think we wrote a brief document for the Series A where we sort of shared some updates on trajectory and progress and things like that. Yeah, I spoke to a bunch of funds, and none of them asked us for one either. That was very interesting. They cared a lot more about who are your customers, what's your growth like, how are you going to hit the next milestones that you care about. The deck was pretty irrelevant, honestly. Series B onwards matters more, but yeah, that seed stage was all on customers and traction. That was it.
Out of all the investors you pitched during the process of seed check, as well as let's talk about Series A too, who was the most toughest one?
Ooh, that's a good question. We spoke to a lot of really, really awesome people. I'm trying to remember specific funds. I can without picking on specific funds for a second, I can remember the toughest calls that we had, and it's interesting because it's you sort of you don't realize how different the interpretations of your startup will be between funds, because they the really good ones, they come with their own thesis as well, right? They want to hear what you think, and some people are just there for they want to put money in and they want to make money, and they don't really get what you do, but they're excited. They're not very interesting, honestly. The interesting ones are where they come with a thesis that's very aligned, and that's exciting. You get to have the sparks conversation where they're like, hey, and you could go here, and I'm like, yeah, and then we could go here, and that's really exciting. The hardest ones, I think, were where you rock up and they've got a slightly different thesis, where it's it's close to what you're planning, but it's not what you want to do. And so then you have the discussion of, or you have the mental gymnastics of in theory, they're offering us many millions of dollars, and that's quite nice, and I'd like that, but it sounds like they want to give it to us to go somewhere that we're not planning to go, or that's not quite aligned. And you're trying to work out, is that friction just a now thing, and actually when you explain your kind of direction and product vision, they'll get on board, or will this be a forever they want you to go for this segment of the market or this idea, and you're just going to have friction through the whole way. So I think the toughest ones are always where they just don't get it. And that was never their fault, I don't think, or particularly our fault. It's just those are tough conversations, because essentially you're ruling yourself out from their investment, portfolio, right? You're kind of saying, nah, it's not what we want to do. And that's tough. I think made easier at seed stage by just, having inbound demand. So, it's kind of, we didn't have to go pitch. We had people sort of pitching for why we should take their money, and that was very, very nice. Series A was a little bit more there's a little bit more pitching, but I think the really good funds make it easy, honestly. It's kind of a slightly boring answer, but I think, none of them made the process hard, none of them made the pitch hard. They kind of did their due diligence in advance, and so they came up ready to talk. They came into conversations ready to have a engaged discussion on money and where they wanted to go and things like that. So yeah, they made it very easy in the large part. Yeah.
I don't think you have a favorite one here, but out of the pitching process during the Series A, which investor did you learn the most from?
Good question. I really enjoyed. So we've spoken with basically all of the funds you could think of. So this isn't me sort of plucking out, we only spoke to these guys. So I think some of the conversations that I really, really enjoyed, who we've spoken to before, but I'd say for fundraising and not for fundraising, you generally keep in touch with these guys regardless. So this isn't all from fundraising, but I think honestly, the folks at Index and Point Nine. So Point Nine was the other major investor in our early stage when we went in at seed, and we kind of had them as a really good early stage fund. So they do seed and Series A. They've been amazing for sort of coaching us through those early stages, and I think the interesting and challenging conversations with them was a lot on growth and sort of, are you being ambitious enough, and that was very interesting. And then Index, actually, when we went out for Series A, they were one of the harshest critics in a really good way to kind of get us ready for that. Let's go out for a Series A, and they ended up being our primary investor at the Series A, but they really made us work with that in a good way, right? It's kind of, we really had to think about where did we want to go, how are we going to get there. So yeah, I sort of it's cheating because there are investors now, but like part of the reason they are our investors is because they challenged us, because they kind of really questioned our conviction and direction and all those things. Other people that I really like talking to, the folks at Sequoia were awesome. We had a lot of really great conversations with them through the years as well. We've kind of touched base a few times. Like they know their stuff and they really grilled us. And yeah, there's some others as well, but I won't go into loads of details and bore you with a long list of investor conversations.
All right. So I'm just going to go to the toughest moments of your company. Can you share one of the toughest moment you had in your company? Like that should be a lot, but what was the number one toughest moment that taught you a lot?
Yeah, I think so. The number one toughest moment in the company, and like I'm just going to be like super candid here. So we had a small round of redundancies earlier this year. So we kind of projected a certain amount of growth. We're doing really well. We're kind of on track to more than double the business this year. But there are a couple of reasons that we ended up I basically over eagerly hired in product, and we sort of didn't quite keep up in GTM. So kind of I accidentally sort of in my organization, and that resulted in having to have some really tough conversations with a bunch of people on my team who are all fantastic, and unfortunately needed to leave the business. And like there's no easy way to make those decisions or have those conversations. I think and a lot of them I'd hire back if I could, right? Those moments are just absolutely brutal. I think you take so much attention and care. For each of those people I probably interviewed 30 other people, right, before I hired them into my company. And you've worked with them super closely, and you invest so much in them, and they invest so much in you. There's no skirting around the fact that like those moments where you have to have those tough conversations are just like the worst, like absolutely the worst. And I think if you're to the second part of your question, that taught you a lot. I think one of the things that we did when we were preparing for that was we spent a lot of time learning from the mistakes of others, honestly, that I think have done a really poor job with that in the industry, and trying to think, well, put myself in this person's shoes, like what would I want? And we worked so hard, and obviously it's like never going to compare to the experience that the folks that left us went through, but we put so much effort into making sure that we supported them, making sure that the way we did the conversations was like as fair as possible and as kind of open as possible. We kind of sweated over when to have the chat so that they'd be able to kind of either be in the office or not in the office, depending on like what they were most comfortable with. All sorts, probably like 100 different complicated and very meaningful one-way decisions that we had to make. And I think one thing that I learned from that is it can often feel like, on the people front, you overthink a bit as a founder, and really you need to be sort of ruthless and focused on the bottom line. And I think we took a very different approach there, where we really thought hard about how we could give people under the circumstances the best experience we possibly could. And honestly, some of the most absolutely sort of like heart-wrenching conversations I've had at the company with folks that they were just so understanding, they were so gracious, they were so appreciative. And I think we could have had those conversations in a number of different ways, and they wouldn't have resulted in that, if that makes sense. And I just think the main takeaway from me there is like, if you really put in the effort and you really care about your people and you really spend the time to kind of have those conversations in a very human way, it will be recognized and it will be appreciated. And I think it's definitely something that I've reflected on. It's like my experience of that, I think, is miles away from the experience of like other founders who have gone through the same thing. And I think part of the reason for that is that as a founding team, but also with the people, with like folks from the people team and the rest of and legal and things like that, we all went in with a like, this is gonna suck. How do we make it as kind as possible for the folks that are affected? So yeah, I don't know, maybe not the sort of like happiest tough example. I think there's plenty of in the trenches moments that I could pick on, but I think one that the toughest moment, if you want it, is that one. And I think my learning is like there's always an opportunity to kind of take care of your people and take a sort of be human attitude, even if conventional wisdom is like HR is callous and uncaring. It's like that wasn't the approach that we took at all. And I think hopefully that was recognized for some of the folks that kind of had to move on.
firing people should be hard. Like almost all the conversations I had, almost all founders told the same answer, like firing people in their organization. That should be really hard, man.
It should be hard, right? You're right. It's like if firing people is easy, you've hired the wrong people, and ultimately, you know, a lot of the folks that are here, like, you know, they're friends, they're colleagues, they're people that I've known for years. It's like there's no one that I work closely with where like it would be easy to let them go, and it shouldn't be. If that's the case, like, you've built a bad company. And I think if you think about the jobs of a founding team, like one of the absolute top priorities, if not the top priority in the early days, is, you know, building the best possible team you can. Like your team are your product, they're your culture, they're your everything, right? And so it's like that's where you spend a huge amount of your time. And so when you eventually have that not work out, or they leave or quit, or you have to, you know, unfortunately sort of let them go, like those are absolutely, you know, soul destroying, right? But you always learn something. You always learn something. If you lose a high performer, you will learn something. If you know, mess up your financial planning for the year or miss your growth targets, like, you know, you learn something, and it sucks, but, you know, it's a rite of passage, unfortunately, and it's also a really important part of the job, unfortunately. But it's, you know, it's what you sign up for, whether you know it or not. In the early days, it's the kind of stuff that you just gotta, you know, you gotta do.
Right. So let's go to the last question. How do you define your life? Is your definition of life work, and what is it for you?
Yeah, I was thinking about this one this morning. I think so. I'm someone that attaches a lot of their, I wouldn't say self-worth, but definitely a lot of my personality and a lot of my, I guess, like, life to work. I think that's deliberate as opposed to an accident. I think, you know, I spend, I would say 8 hours a day, but let's be honest, it's more than that. I'm a founder. Like, half the time it's 12-hour days. Sometimes it's like 16 in the worst cases, right? It's more. So it's like a huge proportion of your life is attached to work. And also, you can't compartmentalize it. Like, you know, my wife knows everything that's going on at work, right? You can't keep such a big chunk of your life sort of squirreled away, and you don't talk about it with your partner. So she understands it. Like, it affects my kid. Like, you know, he has to understand this. Like, I'm not there in the day because I'm at work. And so you can try and sort of totally decouple these two things of, like, life and work. I think in reality, you know, do you want to live your life that way? It's sort of, you know, it's like Severance on Apple TV, right? It's like, do I want to have these two totally different lives? No, I want to be able to sort of bring my full self to work and, you know, not have to not think about and not talk about my home life. I want to be able to take some of my work home, and I want to be able to have a bad day and go home and, you know, moan about it, or have an amazing day and go home and celebrate it. And I think blurring those lines, you know, for me, is something that I care about. It's something I really want to do. I don't want to look back in 80 years, or, well, maybe 80 is ambitious at this point. Let's say 50 years, and go like, oh yeah, there's like half my life that I didn't spend at home and I regret. So for me, you know, the balance or the nuances in finding something that I love doing during that big chunk in the middle of my day outside of weekends where I really love it. And yeah, it's not always easy, and it sucks, and it's ups and downs, but like, so's life outside of work. So I think it's kind of, you know, for me, like finding or marrying that, like, problems I love solving, the kind of stuff I love doing on a day-to-day basis, and then finding a way to leverage that at work, and then not feeling like I have to sort of, you know, keep the two things totally separate. So yeah, I put a lot of, I think I put a lot of, you know, work into home and home into work, and it you know, it works for me. It works for me, and I think it's fine.
I think
more
having
people
had
should feel okay doing it.
I think having had your experience having a kid and running the company at the same time, you should be the one founders should come and talk to about work and work-life balance.
Yeah, I mean, genuinely, I'd love to. Like, if anyone's out there sort of on the cusp of starting a family and has a 12-person team depending on them to get paid and, you know, for their careers, I can empathise. And, you know, if anyone's, you know, going through those, I don't know, like, finish your calls at midnight and then do a bottle feed at 2 a.m. Like, I've been there, right? I feel it. And yeah, I think my main takeaway with all of this stuff is, you know, it's not feeling guilty when you have to prioritize one over the other. And I think if it becomes a theme, that's a problem. So, like, you know, if I have to duck out of work for a meaningful period because I'm at home, I'm not going to feel guilty about that, but you do need to figure out how to make it okay for the company because it's depending on you. And likewise, if I have to kind of, duck out of home because I'm busy doing things at work, it's like, cool, you have to make that okay, and you have to find the balance. But what you shouldn't do is just beat yourself up about it because you're going to have to make those trade-offs. I think it's just a fact of life. So yeah, if anyone wants to share burn fingers and war stories on that stuff, happy to. I described it as like, it's very ironic sort of, building a career off instant management and then having a baby is kind of like, you spend the first half of my career on the pager, and now I have like, another pager, and it's just that this one poops and wakes me up at 2 a.m. instead of, incidents. So yeah, I don't know which one I prefer, honestly, but yeah.
Amazing. Actually, this has been a great conversation. I think I learned a lot, and your story was amazing.
Thank you, appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. It's always enjoyable going down memory lane, and I appreciate the questions and a chance to reflect. I guess it's always fun, and I think you spend so much time looking at the road immediately in front of you, or where you're going. You don't really get much opportunity to look back. So I appreciate you giving me the chance to do that.